Here tonight, Ray Barfield, who's come down from Durham to join us this evening. I wrote this up, so I'll read it to you. So Ray joined the faculties of Duke Medical and Divinity Schools in 2008. He's married to Karen Barfield, who's an Episcopal priest, and Ray and Karen have two children, Micah and Alexandra. Dr. Barfield has an impressive career as a pediatric oncologist and medical researcher, working for many years at St. Jude's Research Hospital. But since arriving at Duke, he's turned much of his efforts towards bridging activities in theology and medicine. He splits his time between teaching at Duke Medical School, where he directs the pediatric quality of life and palliative care program, and Duke Divinity School, where he develops courses and programs that address topics at the intersection of theology, medicine, and culture. As if this isn't enough, beyond his teaching and research in oncology and palliative care, he also writes in the areas of philosophy, poetry, and fiction, having recently published The Ancient Quarrel Between Poetry and Philosophy with Cambridge University Press, and a book-length collection of poetry called Life in the Blind Spot, and a novel that came out earlier this spring called The Book of Colors. So from all this, I find myself being a little bit envious, maybe you do. I covet the 48 hours that Ray has to work with as opposed to the 24 hours that the rest of us have been given. And also, when I read about him, I thought, man, this guy's he's got to be really tightly wound ball of yarn. Not the case. So when I first met Ray a few years ago, I came by his office with a friend of mine. Ray walked in, he come straight from the hospital, took his shoes off, he picked up his guitar, started playing, and then he stopped. And he looked at me, and right when I was expecting him to ask some deep, profound question, this is the question I was expecting him to ask me. Do you believe in the convertibility of the three great transcendentals? Ray's kind of I've never met him before, he's going to ask me this. But he got a thoughtful look on his face. And then he asked me, how do you make a C-sharp guitar chord and drop D tuning? See, this is serious, this is a real story. All of a sudden, I couldn't figure out if I was talking to Dan Auerbach from the Black Keys or a leading teacher and researcher from Duke University. I was delightfully confused. And any you students who have gotten to spend some time with him today, I think you can say that as well. So, we're very pleased to have such an accomplished, self-giving, down-to-earth teacher for our McNair lecture on science and theology this evening. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Barfield, or just Ray, as he prefers to be called, who will be speaking to us tonight on the topic of stories on the threshold of mystery.
So my name is Ray, definitely call me Ray. I mean, I am, when I was asked to do this talk, I almost said no, because I looked at the list of people who had done it. And one of the people is Jennifer Wiseman, who's the lead scientist on the Hubble Telescope project. And she's a great friend of mine. We were Veritas Roof Fellows together for 2 years, we've been friends for years. But the last thing I want to do is follow something that she's done. But at the same time, tonight when I was talking with President Paul and just listening to the way this college works, the way that even the most experienced teachers in the room will come up against questions or come up against texts and say, I'm not really sure what this means. I knew what it meant 5 years ago, but I don't know what it means now. So I'm interested in your thoughts. To me, that's a beautiful approach to education. And the idea that students at a college like this would come up against teachers who are willing to open up texts with their own confession of uncertainty is fascinating and wonderful. And so in that spirit, I don't want to answer absolutely no questions about uncertainty. I'm just going to stumble along until I hit the 35-minute mark and Paul says, "So talking." And then we're going to have the real part of the talk, which is the back and forth, because I can hardly wait to hear your questions and hear your observations. One of the things, I know there are doctors, physicians in the room, and nurses in the room, people who've been around the sick and suffering. One question that has become a very important question to me is, what is it that we're doing when we do medicine? Where's the disco ball? So theology and science is a course that I teach at Duke Divinity School. It's one of my favorite courses that I teach. In this lecture, I'm going to go for something related to theology and science, but not in a formal way. More in the sense of addressing my own love in medicine, which is a place where science interacts with our lives and our stories, our bodies, our hopes, our fears, our dreams, in a way that it doesn't interact with us anywhere else. When a physician walks into a room and tells me, "This is what's going on with your body," and when I know that they're basing their discussion with me about what's happening in my body on some very sophisticated science, my relationship to science suddenly becomes very, very different than when I'm reading an article about whether or not Pluto is a planet. Medicine changes my relationship to science. And the contention that I want to make tonight, the argument that I want to move towards tonight, is that science by itself is not going to be able to get us to a place where we can give a full account of what it is for science to have impact on our bodies. To understand the way that science interacts with our lives and our bodies, we're going to have something more than science. We're going to have a frame. We're going to have a story. We're going to have to, in some way, grasp a larger meaning about what science is talking about and about the universe that it's working in. Now, in America, we find it very difficult to talk about that, which is strange to me in one sense, because it's the only thing that absolutely is going to happen to all of us. But it's not strange in another way, because it's a threshold that is so mysterious. I love your geese. I just love them. And your turtles. But it's a threshold of mystery that deserves the kind of silence that we offer in situations of great holiness. It is a threshold of mystery that we shouldn't just traipse over or think that we know what's going on. So silence, in a way, is a complex thing to me on the threshold of death. But medically speaking, I run the palliative care program, and I'm a pediatric oncologist, and so by virtue of the kind of medicine that I practice, I take care of many people who are looking at the threshold of dying. And I work in the intensive care unit every single day. And one of the observations that I've made about the way that we die in America, the way that many people die in America, is if you look at the left side of this, we start out at some level of well-being with our disease. We have a crisis, and medicine works hard to get us back out of the crisis, come up out of the crisis, but maybe not quite to the place that we were. When we go along for a while and we have another crisis, and medicine works hard to get us out of the crisis, this goes along over and over again. As we get sicker, the intensive care unit becomes an important part of our questions about what we want to happen. We may end up in the intensive care unit where a lot of things are done. We're tuned up. We're able to leave the intensive care unit. But once again, we're not back to quite where we were. And finally, towards the end, we have a crisis that medicine can't pull us out of. And that's what it is to die in the American system. A few days ago, I had a young man die in my service who didn't have a heart. He had an artificial set of tubes that was functioning in place of his heart. Now, his body was trying to die, and had been trying to die for a month, but it couldn't. It became almost impossible for him to die. And he suffered a great deal. And he would talk to me. He asked me to bring my guitar and say, even though I don't know how to play C sharp and E when it's tuned down, I would bring my guitar into the intensive care unit. When I was done with the medical parts of the examination, I would play guitar for him. And then we would talk. He was a Christian. He was a deeply religious young man, 17 years old, very deep in his thinking. And yet, it was baffling to him what to do in the situation because he couldn't die. The tubes would not let him die. And we struggled with this. And we struggled with this for almost 2 months together. A very important thing in his life and in my life. He died in the last few days. So the question is, why do we die like this? This seems to me a question that is ripe for the convergence of theology and science. It's because of our advances in science, and because we are so good in what we do in scientific medicine, that my good friend, who liked to listen to me play guitar, simply could not achieve death. And so he just hovered on the threshold for a long time. He was a beautiful soul, and so he knew what to do, and he taught me a lot. I would take all night to tell you about. Maybe next time. So the question is, why do we die? Basically, it's all discussable. This is actually one of my heroes, Francis Bacon. One of my other heroes, Alan Burke, taught me about Francis Bacon in a way that I had never known before. Francis Bacon, is that me or is that you?
That's me.
Ah, okay. So it's a partnership. Francis Bacon was one of the architects of the scientific method. But as related to the questions we're going to talk about tonight with medicine, an important thing that Francis Bacon did transform medicine by refusing to adopt the Hippocratic tradition, which said that, in part, one of the great roles of physicians is to tell you when you're overcome with your disease. To be able to have the skill and the wisdom and the insight and the experience to walk into a home, to look at someone who's suffering, and to say, you're overcome with your disease. Now is the time to begin planning the end of your life. That was considered a great gift that physicians would give to people. Francis Bacon resisted this. Francis Bacon, who sounds like myself at times in my own life, and like many of my patients, he said, I don't want to walk into the room and have as my wisdom the pronouncement that you're overcome by your disease. I want to apply science to figure out a way for you to not be overcome by your disease and to be cured. And he set us on a road towards the contemporary approach that we have to evidence-based medicine that has produced astonishing results. In my own field as a pediatric oncologist, I take care of children. The most common cancer that I take care of in children is acute lymphoblastic leukemia. In the 1960s, at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, where Don Hinkle was beginning to try out different medicine, we had a 5% cure rate for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. 4 days ago, I admitted a patient with new onset acute lymphoblastic leukemia and was able to tell that patient that we're approaching a 90% cure rate now. Now, the reason we're approaching a 90% cure rate is because we have been pursuing scientific medicine along the plan that Francis Bacon talked about. But at the limits of scientific kind of question arises that my young friend, my young 17-year-old friend, who could not die because of what he was connected to, those kinds of questions come up. And I'll tell you now that, in my opinion, and I'm perfectly happy to be challenged on this, science doesn't have an answer to that, but theology does. Now, medicine has changed dramatically. How many people here are doctors or nurses or respiratory therapists associated with medicine? I'm the only one? I told me there were going to be a bunch of doctors here tonight. Okay. Well, let me tell you, medicine has changed. There was that, well, okay, so I should change that. Physicians, I'm sorry. Yeah, in a room full of PhDs, I should not say there are any doctors here. It's offensive. So medicine has changed dramatically. In the mid-1800s, which is where my own sort of interest in the history of medicine begins, the kinds of things that physicians would do were still, even though they had enormous influence in the way that physicians think, still the things that physicians would do mostly had to do with their presence. They would come into the home, and they would see who it is that's sick. That was extremely important. It was extremely important for them to understand the person that had a disease. Now, one of the founders of scientific medicine, William Osler, is known for a quote. He said, "It's more important to know the person who has the disease than to know which disease the person has." And this from the founder of scientific medicine. But along the way, medicine began to change. We started to develop instruments that allowed us to approach the body in a different way. In the late 1800s, we began to develop graphic instruments that could show on a piece of paper the outlines of the history of a person's pulse or a person's respiratory rate. In 1897, the X-ray was invented. We would take a picture of the inside of the person without ever seeing the person and know some things that were going on and say some things about what needs to happen for this person. In the early 1900s, the electrocardiogram was invented. So someone could bring a piece of paper in with a bunch of squiggles on it, and an experienced physician could look at it and understand the electrical activity of the heart and make a diagnosis about why the patient was experiencing angina, why they were experiencing chest pain. At the same time, in the early 1900s, we began to develop clinical laboratories where you didn't even have to have access to the whole patient. You could just take a piece of the patient into the laboratory and look at it under the microscope and make predictions about what was going to happen to that patient and what sorts of things the patient would need in terms of treatment. And in the mid-1900s, it says late 1900s, but it really happened in the 1950s, the randomized clinical trial became the standard for how we advance scientific medicine, where we have two groups, and by definition, we don't know whether the treatment for group A or the treatment for group B is going to be better. And so it becomes generic. We want to eliminate all variability so that it's applicable to all human beings. We want to eliminate individuality so that we can come up with the most applicable kinds of scientific statements about medicine that are possible. And it was the standardized trial that led us there. And this is allowed for one or that he's cured. I wish that I could tell you how many times I've had parents, I'm a pediatrician, so I talk with parents when a child is sick. How many times I've had parents tell me, if I knew that this is what the cure would look like, I never would accept it. I've stood in intensive care units more times than I can count, with parents standing by me saying, if I just understood, I never would have said yes. So the question that comes up is, what happens to the rest of the person's story? The things that we do in the intensive care unit, the things that I do as an oncologist, have an incredible impact, many times for the good in people's lives. But if all I have access to is an understanding of a person's biology, I'm not going to know very much about how to apply the science to that person's particular life if I pay no attention to anything else about the person except their biology.
The conflict that we come up against in medicine is that we're trained, just like any other scientific discipline, to trust objective data, laboratory results, numbers, and statistics. But as human beings, there's not a single one of us that discovers the meaning of our lives from inside these biological facts that I can mine from the electronic medical record. My father-in-law had a friend who was a surgeon, a brilliant surgeon, went to undergraduate school at Princeton University, Harvard Medical School, trained as a surgeon at Mass General. I'll never forget the day that I walked into my in-law's kitchen, and he was standing there, and I could tell there was a worried look on his face. And he was talking to my father-in-law, and he told me his nap. And he said, I don't know, Jim. Jim's my father-in-law. I don't know, Jim. It's incredible. It just grew. It just started growing, this thing in my neck. Now they have to take it out. And I could tell that he was scared out of his wits that this thing was growing inside his body. And he was talking about it as though he had never seen a tumor before, even though he'd taken out thousands of these things. Thousands of them. After having his morning coffee and his bagel, walked in, taken out the tumor, said, it's this, it's that, it's this, it's that. But when it happened inside his body, all of a sudden, the meaning of the thing changed. And that's when he saw that his biological description of tumors and his technological description of surgery was not enough to account for the story. One of the problems with character stories is it can be incredibly hard to tell about our own experience, even as we're having it. And there are two big issues. We can talk about so many things, but there are two big issues that absolutely come up in the middle of contemporary scientific medicine that are overwhelmingly important as we think about theology and other sorts of approaches to the experience of illness, suffering, and dying. The first one is death. Doctors find it incredibly hard to talk about that. He says, there's no easy way I can tell you this, so I'm sending you to someone who can. I can't tell you how many times that's been me. I've wanted to send the person to the chaplain, to the nurse practitioner, to anyone besides me, instead of sitting down and talking about that. For many years before patients taught me how to talk about that, while I was a bone marrow transplant physician, when someone would relapse afterwards, the first thing that I would do is print off all of the relevant scientific protocols that the patient is eligible for. I would print them out, carry them in the room, so that after I had told the patient that their cancer had relapsed, I could immediately move to a conversation in which I said, but there are all these other protocols that we can think about. Now I know that someone whose cancer relapses after bone marrow transplant is almost certainly not going to be cured. I've cured a handful of people whose cancer relapsed after bone marrow transplant. And yet, until patients taught me how to talk about death, my habit was to print off scientific protocols and walk into the room, and that was going to be my backup plan for having a conversation, so that I could scoop them into an arena where I was comfortable. Woody Allen said, well, I have trouble with Woody Allen, believe me. But I like this quote. I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I get it. One of the questions that comes up to me, though, as I think about being a physician working at Duke University in a scientific environment that heavily weighs towards evidence, but it has precious little room for the kinds of stories that I want to talk about later in the evening. One of the questions I have is, why is it that we have trouble talking about that? And I think that one of the reasons is that we don't see that very much anymore. We just don't see it. I've been in African villages and spent time there where death is present on a daily basis. The death of children, the death of adults. It was just something that was a part of the culture. But in our culture, in part because of our advances in medicine, we simply don't see that. The other problem, of course, is that we sequester at the hospital. So that when it happens, it doesn't happen at home as much as it might. It doesn't happen in our community. It doesn't happen in our church. It doesn't happen. So we don't see it until everybody's made up. Where do we encounter that these days? Well, one place is video games. I have a 16-year-old and a 21-year-old. I had no idea the power of video games.
but they're everywhere. And this is one place that we encounter death. The thing about death in video games is that when you're killed, you have a 5-second penalty, and then you're back up. You continue to move. That'll change the way you think about it. Kenny on South Park, every episode he dies. Next episode he's alive. Celebrities, you will see an outpouring of passion and sorrow when a celebrity dies. CDs will be made, commemorative CDs that will be bought around the globe. And then a few weeks later, it's like the water is closing over the Titanic. You see us still, and you just forget about what's happening. And go on as we were going on before. Now, I don't have anything at all to say about Sarah Palin. I'm not a political person in that way. But she was an extremely important catalyst for a discussion about death penalties. This is something that in the news has recently been readdressed in a very new way. If you remember back in the Affordable Care Act, and again, I'm not here to defend or to oppose the Affordable Care Act, but when it was being debated, there was a non-controversial clause that was produced in a subcommittee of the Senate. It was a bipartisan clause, and no one thought that it was a problem. The clause merely said, if a physician is going to spend an additional amount of time helping someone who's moving towards the end of their life understand what their options are, that physician should be compensated. And the hope was that compensation for these kinds of conversations would encourage physicians to fully explain options to people so that they didn't get stuck unnecessarily in situations that made no sense for them given the rest of their life. That's what the clause was trying to achieve. But it was turned into a discussion about death panels and the government closing off, turning off ventilators on your grandmother and things like this. It was reintroduced about 7 months after the initial kerfuffle, and it was again smashed. But just recently, it's been brought back in to the legislative arena, and it looks like this is going to happen, where people will be remunerated and encouraged by remuneration within their institutions for helping people to fully understand options at the end of their life, instead of just having to juggernaut with technological medicine, roll them along until they end up in Social Security, which happens very often now. So death is one big issue. Suffering is another one of the big issues. And I deal with this on a regular basis. In the program that I do, we do a lot of pain consult. So I frequently am asking people about the form of their suffering. I once had this incredibly creative girl who had severe abdominal pain that had kept her in the hospital for a month. Her team had stopped believing that she had pain. They'd done all of the things that came to mind, but they thought she's just trying to stay out of school. She's just trying to fool us into meeting her wishes so that she can have her secondary gain. So I walked in the room and I said, I need to understand your discomfort. She looked at me, she said, I don't have discomfort. I have pain. Well, show me. I heard that you're an artist. Show me what your pain is. Show me what your suffering is, and then we'll see what we can do. And that's the drawing issue. And to me, when I look at this, I think to myself, I may not know exactly how to populate the word pain for her, but something is happening inside this young woman that I need to. And she was able to tell me, she was able to get my attention, not by pointing to data or to the electronic medical record, but by drawing me a picture. And I carried this picture to her team. And as soon as they saw it, they stopped talking about her using pain as an excuse to not go to school or an excuse for this or an excuse for that. And they started saying, we need to help this young girl. So we came up with some ideas for her. And by the end of the week, she'd been discharged from the hospital pain-free. Now, I took this as a deep lesson and went to a talk that I gave in Dallas. It was a Duke talk. I don't know how many Duke people we have there, but it was for people whose kids were in Duke, for people who were associated with Duke down in Dallas. And it was there are actually a bunch of executives, a bunch of highly successful people. And I thought I would do an experiment after this child's expression of pain. I asked them to just draw me a picture
So I asked these executives to draw. There were 400 people. All right, so it was a big room of powerful people. And I asked them to put crayons and little pieces of paper on their table. I was worried that they were going to be offended, that they were going to think I was treating them like second graders. But as I began to talk, I said, I just want you to write down a picture of what pain is to you. Just whatever it is, whatever comes to mind. It can be a word, it can be a picture, it can be whatever you want. I want to show you a few of the pictures that they drew. I had no idea what they were going to do. I thought, highly successful people probably don't even acknowledge that they have pain because they're so tough. Here's their pictures. I was stunned by this, but I was mostly stunned by the fact that in this room full of powerhouses, successful people who from the outside looked like they just were conquering the world, they were fine. They didn't have pain. They didn't have the trouble that the rest of us mortals had. Guess what? When I asked them to show a picture, like a little 2-year-old, of what the inside of them looked like, that's what it looked like. I have a lot more of these. I just wanted to put up a sample. I found it very powerful. And so I walked away from that and from my experiences in the hospital and my experiences where technology and evidence-based medicine simply cannot give a full enough account of the human experience of illness, suffering, and death, thinking there's got to be more. I love science. I love science. And I am grateful for the kinds of things that science contributes to our experience of illness and suffering, that can overcome illness and suffering when we can. But I walked away with the contention that it's a story like the story that we hear in church, in our Sunday school lessons, in Scripture, in theological reflection of what the universe is like. That we begin to grapple with much larger questions that become a context in which we do medical science. The question, though, is does this actually make a difference in our lives as people who are committed to a theological framework, but whose bodies are going to fail? I've had cancer. I know what it is to be told we don't have chemotherapy for this, and so we're going to just excise this melanoma and hope it doesn't come back. I know what it is to be scared. And it's a very personal question to ask. Does theological framing, does Christian practice actually make a difference in the way that I navigate my interactions with Well, that's a good question out there. This is a Dana-Farber study. It came from Harvard. And it's a busy slide, so you don't have to pay too much attention to it. But it looked at people who had severe, complex, chronic, potentially life-threatening illness, who identified themselves as people supported by their church, by their religious community. And what they wanted to know is, among these people who identify themselves as very supported by their religious community, to what extent do they make use of intensive care? To what extent do they make use of hospice? And to what extent do they die in an intensive care unit? Now, there were 3 possibilities for these groups. Everyone in the group identified themselves as having a strong connection to a religious community that supported them. One group had no discussion about end-of-life care and had no visitation by a spiritual chaplain, minister inside the hospital that was associated with the medical team. But they did identify themselves as supported by the church. The second group either had an end-of-life conversation with their doctor, or they had a visit by a chaplain, by a pastor, in the hospital.
The third group had both a visit from the chaplain and a discussion with their physician about end-of-life care. And what this team from Harvard discovered is that the patients who had identified themselves as supported by a religious community who had neither a conversation about end-of-life care nor a visit from a hospital chaplain had the lowest use of hospice. The ones who had either a visit from the chaplain or a discussion about end-of-life care with a physician had a medium amount. And the ones who had both had the greatest use of hospice towards the end of their life. When they asked about receipt of aggressive interventions, the people who had neither had the highest level of aggressive interventions. People who had one or the other had a medium amount, and the people who had both a discussion about end-of-life care with their physician and a spiritual counseling visit from the hospital chaplain had the lowest use of aggressive measures at the end of life. And when they asked about who dies in the intensive care unit, which if you've never been in an intensive care unit, let me just tell you, it is a traumatic, very powerful, very scary sometimes place. At the end of life, it's especially scary. The people who had neither end-of-life conversations nor a visit from the chaplain had the highest incidence of death in the intensive care unit, even though they associated themselves equally with the church. The people who had one or the other had a medium, and the people who had both an end-of-life discussion and a visit from the chaplain, who discussed and framed things in a different way than a physician would frame them, had the lowest incidence of death in the intensive care unit. That tells me that the kinds of conversations that need to happen in the hospital are not simply conversations that are driven by science, but conversations that are driven by spiritual realities that all of us live day in and day out, and inform the way that we make decisions about how science should apply to our lives, especially at the end of life. So my question is, how do the practices of the church prepare us? And it's not a question that I have a great answer for. I'm married to a priest, my dad is a pastor, but I don't have an answer for this. It seems to me, though, that we would do poorly to ignore the reality that ill people, suffering people, and dying people are not simply making treatments about how to apply science. No, they are in real time facing ultimate questions that show up in Scripture, in theology texts, in seminaries, in sermons. They are facing it in real time right now at the bedside, and it's going to happen in the next day, in the next 2 days, in the next week. These are ultimate questions about themselves, about people they love, and about the nature of the world. But these questions are not questions that are addressable by science. They simply aren't. These are the kinds of questions that we see show up in the domain of theology and our practices of response to our Creator. We can't understand the meaning of the decision, in my opinion. When we're ill or dying, we don't consider the whole story. And for me, storytelling has become intensely important. We have to ask the question, what is the story? We're almost to the end now. This is a book I want to recommend to you. It's by Peter DeVries. Peter DeVries had a troubled relationship with his own belief in God. But he experienced the death of his 12-year-old daughter who died from leukemia. And he wrote this novel. It's not an autobiographical novel, strictly speaking, but it's a novel that he wrote drawing on the insights he had as he watched his daughter die in the middle of scientific community in contrast in the hospital. And it's a very well-told story. Peter DeVries is hilarious. His other novels are comic novels, and so I recommend this novel too. But each story that matters, each story that's good, starts with a Once Upon a Time. And the Once Upon a Time sets the stage for who it is that's going to be involved in the story. Once upon a time, there was a little 12-year-old girl. And every day, so this part of the story, you can use this to write a novel, you can use this to write a short story, you can steal it, you can do whatever you want to, but it works in every case. This part of the story, and every day, gives you the background. It helps you understand what's normal in that person's life. And you're going to have to understand what's normal if you're going to understand what's lost. And every day, she would play with her friends,
She played the piano. She enjoyed playing with her pets. She enjoyed painting. So one day, now this part of the story is where the I'm an oncologist, and so I am frequently the author of the Until One Day for people. But since I'm a cancer doctor, my Until One Day can be pretty rough sometimes. Story, until one day, the doctor said, "Honey, I'm sorry to tell you this, but those funny looking cells that we saw under the microscope, those are leukemia cells. You have cancer." Now the story proceeds from that point in a very different way. And because of this, she began chemotherapy. And because of this, she lost her hair. And because of this, she was unable to go to school. And because of this, she lost her music. And because of this, she got behind in school. And because of this, she stopped being hopeful that she would ever become a veterinarian like she wanted to. And because of this, and so on, and so on, and so on. And because of what her story is, I make a scientific diagnosis of leukemia. This child's experience is an experience of a loss of parts of her story. And if I want to understand what this means to her, I'm going to have to understand what her story is. Otherwise, all I see are leukemia cells under the microscope. So the story proceeds, and because of this, until finally, now this is an important turning point in any novel or short story, and it's important in any sort of drama like the one that children with leukemia experience. Until finally, the leukemia was cured. Or, until finally, the leukemia recurred, and there were no further therapies to give. Now you may think that that's the end of the story. But if you really understand how stories work, you'll know that there's another part to the story. And it's the last part of the story, which is, and ever since that day. And so if the until finally is, until finally her leukemia was cured, the last part of the story will show what it is to now live in light of the experience of having had leukemia. If her leukemia is not cured, there's a very deep question that theology addresses, which is, all right, so what does ever since that day look like now? What does it look like now that you know how you're going to die? So the question that I want to raise, and the place where I think that theology has one of its most powerful approaches to framing our stories, is to ask, how does theology frame that last part of our story ever since that day, no matter what the outcome is? Medicine cannot tell you how to frame that last part of the story. Science cannot tell you how to frame that last part of the story. We have to have a different mode of inquiry, a different mode of relating to our lives and to the world and to our God, if we're going to understand how this last part of our story goes. And this is a place where I think that science and theology meet in my own discipline, which is medicine. So my final contention then is that theology and the arts help us to see, hear, and express and understand the actual lived experience of illness, suffering, and dying in a way that science can merely be the servant to, but not the God to. Thanks. Do we have time for questions?
Oh, we got 10:15.
10-15, not one on that long?
Yeah. No, that's fine. Well, with the broken mic, or whatever, non-functioning mic, talk really loud, and if you will, if you can restate the question, whenever someone raises it, I'll just keep an eye on the clock. Yeah, so that everyone can hear.
Sure. And feel free also, if you don't have a question, but you have an observation or a critique or something, please feel free to say that as well. It doesn't have to be a question, it can just be, I think this.
I have something to say. The school had a little bit of a jam this morning, and they needed a projector. I happen to have one that had been in the container for about 5 years, had not been used, and I was unaware of what the subject was going to be tonight. It's interesting that the person who owned that projector suffered from cell transplant and all that went through it, and to view this story and to hear these words tonight would have been great help for me and that person 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, but to see it through that lens and to hear it tonight has been very helpful to me in retrospect, but that it came through that projector. It's not cool to me. It's been a big help for me to hear that. And had I seen those projections and the different cycles and what to expect and what you spoke about, talking to pastors and having counsel in ICU and how that related to my experience was very interesting.
Thank you. Students. Hey, this is your chance to shine. Yes, sir.
On your question about death and our unwillingness to address death, you just talked about the death of people. We don't have butcher shops anymore. What we eat, we don't see killed. We don't even see the vegetables.
No, that's absolutely right. The extent to which our culture goes to hide that is stunning. And it makes death, when you see it, shocking in a way. It makes it very, very hard to think of it as something that was genuinely a part of our life, that we can be communal about. I'll tell you that, with animals, so the hiddenness of death and the hiddenness of the suffering of the animals, that's something that is a very important topic. We can do a whole session on that. Among people, I have stopped thinking of dying as a medical event. It's not a medical event. It's a spiritual event. And dying, the experience of dying is something that should be owned, embraced by the same communities that accepted us after we were born, that took us in, that raised us, that tended us when we broke our legs or straightened our knees, that helped us when we were hungry. Dying should be something that everyone in this room feels like they have access to. It shouldn't be something that you have to have permission from me as the doctor to walk into the intensive care unit and participate in the dying process of someone that you love. If you love them, they're yours. They're not mine. So you should have access. I should have access. Somebody's not. But we've closed off access. It's very hard to get to a dying person who you love in the hospital. It's easy for me because I have a little badge. I can walk into a stranger's room, and you might have known a person for 30 years, and you can't get there. Something's wrong with it. Yes, sir.
That story you told at the very beginning of that young man reminded me of something. I've been involved with hospice county here for the last 10 years, and certainly heard a lot of stories and quite a lot of situations, but there's one in particular that comes to mind. There's a lady who's dying and would not allow herself to die. And was having a very, very difficult time of it, and as the days went by, so was her family, because they were starting to frazzle. As every minute they were thinking this is going to happen, and then it didn't happen, and it would be another day, another day, another day. One of the nurses who had been working with her for a long time, who understood her, understood the family, had an insight into maybe what was going on. She said to the lady, and this is as the story was told then afterwards, you did a good job as a mother. I've seen your kids here day after day. They are terrific. You have succeeded. You don't have anything to worry about. You set them up for their lives. And knowing the woman as she did, she knew the lady's favorite hymn. And she said, hey, just relax, just relax. She started singing this lady's favorite hymn. was saying, I cannot allow myself to die in case you might need me. And the family members there in the room had an overwhelming experience, which they themselves are the ones who shared afterwards.
That's a terrific story. That's an absolutely terrific story. And that's the kind of insight into the mystery of dying that makes all the difference in the world. And that I promise you, will show up nowhere in the daily review of sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarb, creatinine, BUN, magnesium, phosphorus. It'll show up nowhere in there. I don't know. She's just still alive today. Okay, well, you write the note. No, give it to the medical student. You know, this is how the conversation goes. And yet there's that dramatic reality that opens up something that is a fundamental human sort of truth, a sense of wanting to care for the people who have relied on us, of wanting to be needed, our sense of deep human love, a sense of legacy, a sense of patience, a sense of worry of who's going to be left behind, or worry from, I mean, all of these sorts of things only come out in the form of stories like the one you just told. Beautiful. Anyone else?
So,
Oh, yeah.
how do you personally deal with a patient that's beyond your help?
I haven't met one yet. I used to meet them all the time. I used to meet people beyond my help all the time. And it almost killed me. It almost made me leave medicine. But the problem was that I was defining help in a very particular sort of way. That first slide that I showed, what is medicine, I had on there a picture of a book. It's called The Anticipatory Corpse by a theologian and physician named Jeffrey Bishop. And if I were to give you a 30-second review of what his 300-page philosophical slog is, it would be this. When physicians show up to medical school, they're relatively normal people. And they walk into their first class, and their first class, they get their patient, their hand their patient. Patient's dead. And they learn where all the molecules sit. They're static, dead patient. Then when they finish anatomy, they go to their next class, and they learn physiology. And they learn what it's like for all of those molecules that they memorize in anatomy to be moving in the right direction. Then they go to their next class, which is physiology, which is pathology. And everything that they learned about molecules and physiology, they learn in pathology, but in a different way. They learn what rogue molecules look like. And they're going in the wrong direction, right? And then they go to the wards, and they learn surgical and medical techniques to make rogue molecules that are going in the wrong direction or threatening to slow down and stop and go in the right direction. And then they graduate all doctors. And the two things that they've acquired in the course of their $45,000 a year education is a sense of their vocation, which is to keep molecules going in the right direction, and a sense of what the definition of life is, which is molecules in motion. Well, molecules in motion is a thin definition of life to me. It's too thin to account for the kind of richness that you were talking about in your story, and several people. There's so much more to what I would want to include in a true definition of life beyond molecules in motion. And a sense that my vocation as a physician is to make rogue molecules that are going in the wrong direction go in the right direction. And that's it. Is too thin a definition of what my calling is as a physician. I'm called to stand with people who are on thresholds that are uncanny and that are frightening. And they may represent a kind of loss that I have no explanation for. But I do have some stories that may start to help us to accommodate the loss that's coming up. So when you ask about a patient that I can't help, well, if my vocation is truly to do nothing but make rogue molecules go in the right direction and keep them going, then when a person gets to the point where my medicines and my surgical techniques no longer make the molecules go in the right direction, I have failed. I can no longer help them. But if I deepen my sense of what my calling is, of what it is to be a physician, and of what life actually is, then there's no one that I help. Because I can walk into a room in the last moment of a person's life, take a hold of their hand, put my other hand on top, simply be present and not run away in fear, and be doing something that matters. That person whose hand I hold while they die is not beyond my help, because I'm there, right? So I don't have any patients that are beyond my help. I know what you were asking, I just didn't answer it. It's a great question. Any other thoughts?
Do you think giving birth is the same as dying? That say it's the same process. Do you think birth and death?
Well, when my wife was screaming at me while our baby was coming out, I would have said yes. No, that's a really good question. And I'm sorry. So is birth the same as death? Is giving birth the same as the process of dying? And that's exactly the kind of question that is a fundamentally theological question. Because what you're asking is, I show up in this world by no choice of mine. I did not choose. I did not ask to be here. I did not set conditions for my showing up. But I'm here. And incredibly, having shown up, I can think, I can love, I can make love, I can make beauty, I can watch a sun, I can be hurt. All of these stunning things can happen. But I did not choose to show up here. I just showed up. Just when I start to get used to this, when the doctor walks in and says, I'm so sorry to tell you that pain up here, stage 4 colon cancer, and we don't have a cure for it. The most that we can do is palliative chemotherapy in your life, but you will die from this, and the time's come for you to put your affairs to work. Well, now I'm leaving by no choice of my own, against my will, in the middle of my project. So I didn't show up in my request, and I don't disappear by my request. It just happened. In that sense, I think that the two are profoundly similar, at least in terms of the effect they should have on us in our humility as we tell stories about the meaning of life. I also think it's a place where theology and its assessment of what it is for God to reveal God's self to us, it makes the two very similar. Because for those of us who don't believe that the universe popped out of nothing and is just a conglomeration of atoms coming together, for those of us who believe that God, whatever God is, and I have no idea, because I'm a Thomist. Me and Thomas Aquinas. We don't know what God is. But whatever God is, I can tell a story about how we show up. It's very different from just popping out of nothing. And I can tell a story about what it is to die that's full of a kind of hope that is not possible if it's just a dissolution of molecules. I don't know what to say about the stories themselves. That's why we need to do. That's why we need the church. That's why we need practices. That's why we need to risk prayer. Even if you don't believe, still risk it. You can still say a prayer. Even if you don't believe in God, you can say this prayer. Are you there? You can pray that with integrity, even if you don't believe in God. Are you there? And interestingly, you can ask a question with integrity. What if you are? What difference would it make? And you can come up with some really interesting answers without being a theist necessarily. So in those two senses, I think that we're very similar. I feel different from babies born in this kind. So they're also different.
We have time for one more or one more, Chris.
I guess, how does your
And I have both, and I've had both many times.
What's the question?
Oh, sorry. The question is, what kind of difference do I see as a physician when I'm taking care of a patient or the family of a patient who believes that there's an afterlife versus a patient or a family who doesn't believe that there's an afterlife? What's the difference in those two sorts of things? And interestingly, my experience fits what the studies show. The studies, all of the studies that are any good that have come out have shown that people who believe that there's an afterlife are more likely to ask for intensive care interventions, to avoid hospice care, and to not move into a mode of dying than people who don't believe that there's an afterlife. Now, this has been shown in study after study, big studies, and it certainly has played out in my experience. I have yet to have somebody who doesn't believe that there is a God or an afterlife or anything tell me that they want me to do everything to keep blood going round and round and air going in and out. But I have had many people who believe in God and believe that there's an afterlife tell me, you keep that going. I've had of all religions too. If we had time, which we don't, I would tell you a story about a Muslim father that I had. One of the most stunning conversations that I've ever had. One of the most beautiful conversations that I've ever had. That moved from him saying, I don't care what it is. I don't care if you break his ribs in the last few seconds of his life. I want you to resuscitate him, even though the child is not. And at the time, the reason was because, and this is the common thing, because if you are in a position where you desire a miracle from God, heal him. And the condition for you getting the miracle from God is that you have faith that God can do it. And if the evidence that you have faith that God can do it is that you keep the machines going to give God time, then you've set up a connection there between the machine, expression of your faith, and the condition for the miracle that you desire that will make it almost impossible for you to do anything other than to add machine on top of machine on top of machine. If you have a wise pastor who can walk into the room and help you reframe theologically the way that you're thinking about the relationship of God and prayer to us, to our short lives that are going to be short no matter what, stunning things can happen in the room. And this Muslim dad that I mentioned, by the end of our conversation, all right, I am going to tell you this. I know we're out of time. I am going to tell you this part of the story because I'm a Christian and he's a Muslim. And so I didn't know if I would have anything interesting to say to them when they asked me. The ICU didn't ask me to talk with him until the very end of this kid's life. The kid is in there. He's on pressors for his heart. He's on an oscillator, which is an advanced form of ventilation. He is on dialysis. The child, his body is trying to die. And his dad had said, I don't care what you think. I want you to do anything that you have to. You can stick a needle into his heart. You can inject epinephrine directly into his heart. You can put in chest tubes. You can push on his chest. I know he's osteopenic and he'll break every rib in his body. I don't care. Just do it. That was his take. So, the Christian who's never met him before walks into the room. Sounds like another setup for a job. And I had no idea what to say. There was this beautiful music that was going on. And so I turned to him and I said, what beautiful music that is. And he said, it's not music. I said, it's not. What is it? He says, chanting. Well, what are they chanting? The Quran. Well, I don't speak Arabic. What part of the Quran are they chanting? And he listened for a moment. And he said, they're chanting the part of the Quran that says, we may wish things to be a certain way. God may say yes. God may say no. But whatever God says, praise be to God. Now, I thought, you got to be kidding me. That's what's being chanted right now. And so I began asking questions about it. And by the end of the conversation, it took about a half an hour of conversation, and I did not direct him one iota. All I did was to ask him questions about God as he experienced God. And by the end of the conversation, he had come to a place where he had reframed what it is to be given the gift of a child, and to be given the dignity of being the father of a child, and of being an advocate for a child in the context of high-tech medicine, and what faithfulness to God, as he understood God, looked like. He's the one who came to that conclusion. And I walked out of the room. I was told later on by the intensive care unit that 10 minutes after I left, he walked out to the intensive care team and said, "We're finished. When he dies, let him die peacefully." But he was able to do that in faithfulness to God as he understood God, with no prompting, nothing more than curiosity. Tell me more about this God. You know? So that's a long answer to a question that deserves a much longer answer. But I hope that helps. All right, thank you very much.
Some other thank yous